Hi, welcome back to Global Corporate Social Responsibility with me, Bill Herman, your professor for the semester. I am really excited to talk about stakeholder perspective this week. I've already got the slide deck loaded, as you can see, because I think it's really important to go ahead and jump right in. And a few words real quick before I do that this perspective, the idea of stakeholders and how we identify them, how we measure relationships with them, how we think about relationships with stakeholders, and whether we come at it from a more normative ethical perspective or from a more strategic profit maximizing perspective, that discussion is absolutely foundational to everything that we're going to do this semester. And so I'm really emphasizing it here so that we can make sure that everyone is on board. I am going to hammer home some of what's in the textbook a little bit more than I'm going to do for the rest of the semester. Most of the semester, I'm going to say, read the textbook, it's in there, it's good. And then instead, for lectures, pick out a topic or an idea, or even use the chapter as a way to riff on something related that I also think is interesting and valuable for you to know. For this topic in particular, I think it's really important to make sure that we're all absolutely on the same page. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. So the topics we're going to cover in this lecture on Chapter 2 include a quick overview of the stakeholder perspective, and then we're going to talk about how we can categorize stakeholders. That includes categorize them as either internal or external, and then as primary or secondary. The textbook focuses a little more on the second one, primary versus secondary, but I think it's also important to just really conceptualize the difference between internal and external stakeholders. And then we're going to ask one of the big questions that comes up this semester over and over again is, does treating stakeholders well lead to more profits? And the answer is generally, largely, depending on a lot of specifics. And we'll talk about a couple of the studies that unwrap some of what those specifics look like. I will also be posting those research studies along with the lecture here. And then we'll talk about the 6-step process for implementing a stakeholder perspective that the textbook goes into. I won't hammer too much on what the textbook already covers, but each of these points I think requires a little bit further elucidation or clarification. And so I'm going to really focus my efforts there. So without further ado, here is the lecture, the first section of the lecture that you'll be enjoying, and that's where we look at the stakeholder approach in the form by way of a stakeholder overview. So what do I mean when I talk about the stakeholder approach? Well, first of all, we have to make sure that we're on the same page about who stakeholders are. A stakeholder is anyone who has a stake in your company in either a literal or a metaphorical sense. So it's not just stockholders. Stockholders are the people who literally have a financial stake in the sense of like they own the company. In that literal sense, stakeholders are stockholders. But I mean a much bigger group of people than that. I mean any person, group, or entity that can be affected by your business and or that can affect your business. So do I pay taxes in my community? Yes, no. Either way, my community is a stakeholder in my company. Right? And my community has an interest in how my company performs because my company affects that community. Are you a customer or not a customer? Right? Your behavior can affect my business. So customers are stakeholders. And the products I sell you can be high quality or low quality. It can be marketed honestly or marketed deceptively, right? And therefore it can affect you. And so customers are a pretty good example of stakeholders. I've got a whole list of examples of stakeholders. We'll talk about those. But so it's all about, in other words, we have relationships with stakeholders. Anybody your company has a relationship with is a stakeholder. Now that relationship can be like any relationship. The relationship can be mutually beneficial, or they can be one-sided. They can be predatory. They can be distant or intimate. It can be a simple relationship, or it can be a really complicated relationship. Just about anything that you can say about a relationship is potentially something you can say about the relationship between a company and a stakeholder. So here are some examples. I'm going to go through a few different examples, and for each of these, I want to make sure that you're comfortable being ready to answer two different questions in the abstract, right? How can a business affect that stakeholder, and how can that stakeholder affect the business? For each of these examples, I want you to be comfortable answering this question. How can the business affect them, and how can they affect the business? I think sometimes it's really easy to see that, and sometimes we have to step back and ask a little bit about each potential question because it's not necessarily obvious. So like I said, the owners are one set of stakeholders. In publicly traded companies, we're talking about shareholders, people who own shares in the company. So if you have a retirement plan at work, or any investments in the stock market, or any mutual funds or anything like that, you are a shareholder in a company, and they're probably surely a shareholder in a company. And that would mean that you are therefore a stakeholder in that company in a meaningful and important way. Now, for most of us, that relationship is really detached, really tenuous, really minor. So I have all of my investments are in the broad market, or are in a really broad assortment of bonds, right? Like I'm not invested heavily in any one company. In the news lately, you may have seen a few examples of folks who've put a lot of money invested in one company in particular. That's an interesting strategy. That's not my strategy, and that's not most people's investment strategies. And so most ordinary investors will have a fraction of a share in a company, or 2 or 3 or 5 shares in a company, maybe. That you're not talking about a substantial relationship with any one company. But major shareholders are tremendously important stakeholders that we have to think about managing those relationships with us. So it's pretty easy to think about how the business can affect how business decisions by a business can affect the stockholders, right? Because the stock goes up or down based on whether it's managed well or managed poorly. That's that much I'm sure you're learning in your finance class. But and I want one or more volunteers now to help me answer the second question here. When stockholders buy or sell a company enough to really move the price a lot, how does that affect the business?
We saw that a couple days ago with GameStop. I mean, Reddit saw that a lot of stockholders were, looking to pounce on GameStop because the stock was going to go down. So lots of people started buying GameStop, and the price went up. And then Robinhood stepped in and said, "Well, can't do that much anymore. Now it's a big ordeal."
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of just a tremendous number of interesting angles and takes from the GameStop story. I think Robinhood's role in that is one of those. The what was the company? I forget what was the company that was buying the information from Robinhood to engage in high frequency trading on the back end. Like that's super interesting too. I like many of you, I think anybody who's interested in following the business news much at all has probably gotten 150. I mean, like every podcast I listen to is like another take on GameStop for the last 5 days. So that's been I think it's great. But the one I'm most interested in here is what happened to how is GameStop different at even let's say when it was $40 a share, let alone, I mean, the valuations it's hit have been just bonkers, right? But let's say, 5 was too low, but it kind of settles in at say somewhere between 20 and 40. How is the difference between 5 a share and 20 or 40 a share? How's that going to play out on a day-to-day basis for a company like GameStop?
Their valuation is much higher, and then for anybody who is a shareholder, both either large or small, has a much bigger stake in being a shareholder.
Sure. Absolutely. So the shareholders are doing a lot better. What can the company do things at $40 a share that it can't do at 5 a share? Are there things it can't do at 5 that it can do at 40? Or that are harder to do or easier to do?
Well, they are raising more money, equity financing. So
Yeah, absolutely. If your share price is really high, financing is easy. Financing is easy. Apple can borrow money and barely pay more than the US federal government pays in interest rates to borrow money, because everybody would love to loan money to Apple. Because why not? Why not? Apple's not going anywhere. Apple's rock solid. We believe in the value of Apple long term, right? Whereas if JC Penney comes to you and says, "Hey, I want to sell you some of my bonds," what are you going to say?
Are you still in business?
Probably not.
Probably no. How's that whole going concern thing going for you, right? Like, who could, what would okay, I'm JC Penney. What do I have to do to get you to yes?
Rebrand.
Okay, sure. So make some different decisions, possibly. Yeah, maybe turn the company around a little bit. I think the JC Penney brand is kind of shot. I think that's fair. What else though? In a real immediate financial sense?
Maybe just incentivize you, like give you dividends or something like that. Offer some kind of
Sure.
potential gain for you to invest in a likely failing company.
Yeah,
Sure,
or
sure.
protections if it is to go south.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
increase earnings per share.
Sure. These are all good strategies. The most immediate thing, if I want to borrow money in the bond market, is I'm going to pay through the nose. I'm going to pay through nose. If I'm a penny stock of a company on the verge of bankruptcy, if my stock is really low, then the amount I have to pay to borrow money is really high, and then that creates a downward cycle, right? Because I can't get the liquidity to reframe to restructure my business to do things like give out dividends or rebrand and restructure my company, because nobody will loan me money at a sensible rate, so I have to pay through the nose, and because I have to pay through the nose in the bond market, and then I can't fix my company to bring my stock price back up. Instead, it keeps going down, and then the interest rates I have to pay go up higher and higher, or people are just less and less willing to invest in me at all. And so the companies like JCPenney I haven't checked in on them lately, but you can get into a real downward spiral that way, and they certainly have done that. And if it hadn't been for the Wall Street Bets Reddit intervention, then GameStop may have gotten to that point as well. So they were pushing the point where their stock was maybe going to stop being traded on the regular markets, and you have to go through this obscure, like literally paper-based trade system, which really reduces your ability to buy and sell stock in a company, and therefore again downward spiral in terms of like the value of the company. So the $40 a share versus, if it settles in the 20 to 40 range, GameStop is fine. If they were going to stay in the $5 range and head downward from there, they were in some real trouble. So that's how stockholders invest or don't invest in a company really does shape the potential opportunities for a business as well. Managers and leadership also have a huge effect on businesses. I think intuitively the question of how management affects a company and how the business affects the managers who are paid for their services or not paid, or paid well or poorly for both of those answers. Obviously, there are a lot of specific versions of those answers, but the broad layout of how that looks like is a going to be reasonably straightforward. This is a lot of what we talk about across all our different classes here. But does anyone know who this particular CEO to be is? Anyone recognize her? Her name is Roz Brewer, and she's the incoming CEO of Walgreens. She's incoming in mid-March. She will be appointed as she's currently the COO of Starbucks. Has had a huge role in shaping their digital rollout, which I think we can all agree has been a pretty substantial success. I mean, that is definitely some, so many people use a digital platform to get their Starbucks order now who didn't, where you just walk in and holler and stand in line and hope they spell your name right. But the now having done that successfully and had a couple other successes on her resume, she's going to be stepping into Walgreens right at a really important time for the company. I mean, they're certainly most importantly in the broader sense is that they're one of the essential partners for the vaccine rollout. And so it's no exaggeration to say that many lives are in the hands of this woman as she decides how Walgreens can best become a partner with the vaccine rollout. So that's kind of a big deal. I thought that was therefore that's why I chose her as our CEO to highlight today, because Godspeed, man. I hope she's successful, and we all really hope she's successful in this role. As well as employees, it's pretty clear. Same thing. It's pretty clear how a business can affect employees, right? Via pay and benefits that are good or bad. A work environment that's healthy or toxic, that sort of thing. And then how employees can affect a business. That's a lot of what we talked about last time too. Is how the employees by behaving ethically, by doing their job well, can affect a company's bottom line pretty quickly. So again, I think those kinds of answers are relatively straightforward. But I wanted to highlight another company here. And does anyone recognize this chap?
Isn't he that guy that cut his CEO salary by like 70% so everyone could make 70 grand or something?
Yes. He cut his CEO salary from $1 million a year to $100,000 a year, and then used those savings as the bulk of the revenue to pay everyone in his company a lot more. The minimum salary now he's the CEO of a company called Gravity Payments, which is a credit card processor. And they raised the floor of pay at that company to $70,000 a year. They're based in Seattle, and many of you are going through, and we in Denver are going through where Seattle was at about 5 or 8 years ago in terms of this huge upswing in how expensive it is to live there. And so at the time, living on $35,000 a year in Seattle was nigh well impossible. And so he said, let's not do it. And he said he did it for ethical reasons. He just felt like it was wrong for him to take so much money home when he had plenty at a much smaller salary. And also, I mean, you can imagine, like, if you're making $1 million a year, after a couple, unless you're ridiculous unless you're like Nicolas Cage with your money, like, you're gonna be fine, right? After just a couple of those paychecks. So so he's like, I've got plenty, and so for ethical reasons, he just felt like he had to spread the wealth around his company, and chose to do that. But the effect was really dramatic. I mean, productivity grew and grew and grew. He did it. It didn't start all at once too. He gave everyone pretty big raises, like 20% raises or some substantial raise, and productivity just exploded, and the revenue and profit gains outpaced what he was spending on that increased salary. He was like, let's do it again. And he did it again, and it kept happening, and it kept happening. And the limit they finally hit in terms of revenue and profit growth was just because they had to start hiring more people, right? They ran out of what the productivity gains he could get with his current staff, so he had to bring in more people. And then after this happened, now when he goes to hire new people, he's looking at tens of thousands of resumes. Like, everybody wants to work there. It's got a huge, very low employee turnover, very high employee morale, very high employee productivity. And so it's really a success story of doing well by doing good as a company. Now, he as a CEO obviously is doing less well, but he at the same time, I mean, he's constantly on tour giving talks. His book has sold really well. So in some other ways, he's kind of made up for it in other currencies, not all of them being cash, right? Some of them being, popularity and fame, and everyone loves this guy now. So it doesn't hurt that he looks like one of the Hemsworths. I think that's a benefit to him, but that's not the only reason why. So if we and so really, I think the gravity payment story is an illustration of when companies treat employees well. There's a pretty clear relationship between doing that and having a good long-term sustainable business plan. The Costco model that we talked about before, right? If we treat employees well, we're doing the right thing, we're doing right by them, and we're probably making those employees so much more valuable to us, the company, that they're going to stick around and be incredibly loyal to us. Customers, another set of stakeholders. You affect your customers, and your customers affect you, right? They shop with you or they don't. They only get the low margin cheap items with you, or they really splurge when they come in the door. They talk bad about you, or they sing your praises. Customers have a pretty clear relationship with businesses, and affect clearly affect your business. I think that's pretty straightforward. That second question here is pretty straightforward. But when I want you also to think about how businesses affect customers, and I think there are a lot of potential ethical questions here as well. And I think even in grocery stores, right? We think about that. Anybody have any thoughts about how different kinds of grocery stores can have different kinds of effects on their customer bases?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, grocery stores with larger produce sections allow their customers to shop healthier, whereas some, especially grocery stores in lower income areas, tend to have larger sections of pre-made and processed foods that aren't as good for you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very, and it's a very direct effect on the health and well-being of the customer base at that point. So how do we think about that if we're a grocery store chain, right? Where it might be easy to sort of say, segment folks in ways that sort of fit existing stereotypes and existing sort of purchasing patterns. But is there a way that we can reshuffle that so that that we have a better effect on our customer base? I think that's a really good example of how businesses can affect their customers. How do newspapers affect people, right? Do newspapers teach people to be, responsible citizens who value the truth and are support the an honest discussion of the affairs of the day, or do newspapers appeal to the basis instincts of their customers and sort of try to do anything to kind of move papers? And I think certainly in New York you saw both of those strategies at play. The Times really tries to have a more sort of high-minded discussion that is tries to be relatively objective, and then the News and the Post, they don't have subscribers. You have to buy it that day, and so every day, every headline, every cover is just screaming at you to try to get you to buy the newspapers. And so you have all these really outlandish, just crazy, tabloid. I mean, that's it's not just the National Enquirer that is tabloid journalism. Most of tabloid journalism happens in street sale daily papers like that. And so you get crazy headlines like the long considered all-time winner for the New York Post was headless body found in topless bar, right? And so yeah, that's good. I mean, it really grabs your attention. And so what effect do we have on our public discourse by selling newspapers based on that model versus a more sort of high-minded kind of model? So I think this is another really fascinating area for thinking about corporate social responsibility. We got a whole bunch of other stakeholders here as well. I mean, we could do slides like this and just take up the whole class thinking about this. But for each of these, remember, I want you to be ready to answer questions about how can these, even in a specific scenario, how can these stakeholders affect a business, and how can a business affect those stakeholders? Right? Suppliers. Lenders. The numbers vary, but one of my favorite cliches about the relationships between businesses and lenders is, if you owe the bank $10,000, that's your problem. If you owe the bank $10 million, that's the bank's problem. Right? So obviously, it's also your problem in the case of $10 million. And obviously, it's also the bank's problem in the case of $10,000. But those are very different positions for a bank to be in. So communities. How does it affect if the place down the street from me just closed because of COVID, if they reopen as a concert venue or a much louder bar, right? That affects the neighborhood. How do you also think about, we're not a business, but when it comes to affecting the community, I really like to think about the community as stakeholder as a paradigm for MSU Denver, right? Because we are a major economic force in the Denver metro area, and the effect that we have on the community and the effect that the community has on us is a really important part of who we are, So I went to CSU. I have 2 degrees from Colorado State, and the CSUs and CUs of the world are great and fine and valuable institutions, but they're not community institutions in the same way that an MSU Denver is, right? Like 40% of CU Boulder students are from Colorado even, and that's all over the state. Whereas like we're 95, 97% are Colorado students at MSU Denver, and it's something like 80, 85% just from the Denver metro area. So that's a hugely much more community-based institution. And so if, heaven forbid were we to go away, the hole that would leave in the Denver metro area, in not only in terms of employment, right, and the facilities, like the gaping hole in downtown, which frankly would probably be filled with more condos. The gaping hole in employment that would leave, but the gaping hole in educating the future leaders of the Denver business community, the Denver area business community. We do more of that than other institutions because we're a community-based metropolitan regional university instead of a national or international university. So our relationship with the community is much more, in my view, much tighter. So competitors. Your relationship with your competitors is another important one that we think about, right? So obviously there's the basic ethical standard of we should not be lying about our competitors to the press, right? So putting out false stories to them, like in the Dilbert cartoon. But also, I want you to think about the relationships between competitors as not necessarily all being about the competition, right? Not necessarily all about like, oh, if all our competitors go away, that's the best possible thing for us. A lot of times it's steel sharpening steel. So think about all of the places around the country where the technology sector is really big. Obviously, Silicon Valley, the Denver Boulder region is huge that way. New York City, in particular, the Flatiron District, in lower Midtown there. These are places where there are tech conferences every day normally. Not today, obviously. These are places where the suppliers and the training and the critical mass of knowledge and employees makes it possible to do things that no one company could do if they were the only company in town. And so there's a reason why people pay through the nose to live in Silicon Valley and make their employees pay through the nose to live in Silicon Valley, is because being in that or other expensive places like New York or Denver, because it's because they're just, even though there's a bit of a movement in that direction to places like Boise, there's just not enough critical mass there yet. And so you just can't get as much stuff done because there aren't enough competitors there. There aren't enough people who work in that specialty to have the kind of talent pool and the kind of training pool and the kind of supplier and other ancillary business relations that you need. So in some ways, having an area of healthy competition is really helpful. Is really beneficial, right? So like pick a completely different industry, like if you're dealing cattle, being near the National Western Stock Show is hugely beneficial, or at least being able to get there, right? And so if we took that away, right, then or took away all of that competition and just gave it to one company, right, the long-term sustainability would be a lot lower. They'd have anything from microchips to stock breeding, the level of innovation that competition forces and the level of development that competition forces is probably hard to understate, and so hard to overstate. So the having, our relationships with competitors are actually really complicated. It's not just as simple as like, oh, you are trying to beat your competitors, don't get me wrong, right? But it's more, there's more to it than that. Government agencies. Here, the relationship is much more one directional in terms of effects, right? Like the EPA, like again, if you're a chemical plant, the EPA's effect on you is much stronger than the effect that you can have on the EPA. The media.
These are all secondary lenders or secondary stakeholders, right?
We'll talk about the divisions here in a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah. These are second. Well, private. Whether the government counts as a primary or secondary stakeholder, I think is an interesting topic, and I will talk about that. And I think the book has an interesting take on it that's worth taking seriously. The media as well, right? So like if I'm feeding good content to the media, then I'm helping the media as well. If I'm giving them, if I'm making my experts, so like you're Walgreens and you make your chief operating officer available for interviews so that you can talk to Good Morning America about vaccine distribution plans. That's a relationship where you're helping the media. But the media covering you in a way that benefits you or in a way that harms you? As with government agencies, that's a sense in which the effect is much stronger with them affecting the company versus how the company affects them. So the stakeholder approach can be one or both of when we talk about the stakeholder approach, we can mean one of two things. We can mean either normative, like what is the ethical thing to do in terms of how I'm treating this set of stakeholders. Or it can be strategic. Which is just what it sounds like. How do I strategize around a relationship with this set of stakeholders so that I can best benefit the company's long-term profitability and sustainability? So let me put a little bit of that more explicitly up on the screen here. So for normative, we might mean something like we should treat shareholders well because it's the right thing to do. We should treat shareholders well because stakeholders. That's another. I made this typo like 15 times in the slide deck and I caught 13 of them. Sorry. It's a common mistake. You will probably make it too when you're writing about stakeholders. Watch for it. And that. Okay, you're still seeing the slide deck, yes? Yes, okay, thank you. Or what are our company values and how does that shape how we should treat stakeholders? Right. In other words, what is the right thing to do according to our company? What does our company mean by the right thing to do? And then how do we do that in regards to a given set of stakeholders? Right. And I think the sort of COVID illusion of the image here is a good example of what I'm talking about. Right. Unless as a business you are completely reckless, like just absolutely unacceptable behavior around COVID, right? Like, you're a concert hall and you just defy orders and have a concert with 2,000 people, unless you're completely reckless around this stuff, it's little subtle things that determine how many infections you contribute to, mostly. Right? It's subtle things. Do you gently remind customers to wear their masks properly? Which, by the way, we're like a year in. Get your nose in your mask. What? I don't understand how people don't know this. Anyway, but do you gently remind the customer to get their nose inside their mask, or do you let it slide? Those little things probably over time will contribute to some people getting sick or not getting sick in a way that nobody will ever really know is attributed to you, including you and the people that got sick. It's just too unclear where somebody will have gotten sick from. So you're doing those things. You're doing the little things correctly because you care, because you want people to be healthy. Because you want people to be healthy, not because you want the credit for it, but because you want people to be healthy. So I think the businesses that are doing this right, really, there's a lot to say for them. I have a lot of admiration for businesses that are taking the time to intervene with the customers who aren't wearing a mask or wearing it poorly, who are doing the cleaning and stuff behind the scenes where you can't see, right? Who are doing little things that you're not seeing, like temperature checks of employees when they come in and making sure that their employees are getting regular COVID tests. Like, I don't know if King Soopers is doing that. I don't know if Great Clips is doing that.
We are.
Oh, awesome.
Not
Awesome.
the test, but we did have to take antibodies, and we got the vaccine, and we're going to be taking that here soon.
Awesome.
So,
Awesome.
yeah.
Cool. Good. I mean, I'm a loyal King Soopers customer, so I'm
Nice.
I get every feeling that they're a reasonably well run and ethical company. So
We try to be. I think.
yeah, absolutely. So, but I don't know that. I didn't know that unless I asked an employee. So, right. So that's an example of doing right by people because you care, because you think it's the right thing. And in the other direction, the stakeholder approach can mean I have a strategic attempt to manage my relationships with all these stakeholders in a way that best benefits the long-term profitability of the business. Right. So we might ask, how should we treat shareholders to best benefit the bottom line? Stakeholders. I'm gonna have to go through and edit this thing like 4 more times. I should say stakeholders. How do we treat stakeholders to best benefit from the bottom line? This is really embarrassing because like I said, we had a ACSB accreditor visitor during my 11 o'clock class. So, oh well, hopefully she'll forgive me for some typos. And which relationships matter the most to our long-term success?
I'd say customer relationships matter the most to long-term success.
Sure, that's probably true. In most cases, that's probably true. Right. There are exceptions, though. I mean, there are some industries or some companies where there's that one supplier relationship. If that supplier pulls out, you're in trouble. Or if you're in the power business, right? Good luck finding a different power company if you're a customer, right? So then your relationship with the regulators is the most important. So most businesses are probably as the customer. I think that's right. But answering that question strategically, that's another way to look at stakeholder management, the stakeholder approach. And if you're reading an article that says stakeholder management, it probably is taking a strategic approach. If you're reading an article that talks about sort of an ethical or again, a lot of in common parlance and in writing, a lot of people are going to conflate moral with ethical. But either of those terms or words related to those terms, talking about stakeholders, you're probably gonna have more of the former approach, the normative approach. But there's also what I would argue for, which is the sort of normative approach because it's probably also the strategic approach. There's there's what we might call something broader that connects these two threads, right? The ethical approach because it's probably actually also the strategic approach, which is in my 11 o'clock class when we were defining ethics in the discussion on Wednesday, somebody just said karma, right? And I like the idea of karma, not in the strict like religious or specifically Buddhist sense, right? But rather the informal sense in which like what goes around comes around. What goes around comes around. So if I'm selling a junk product to customers, they're going to notice. Even if they don't notice for years, they will eventually notice and they will hold that against me. If I'm picking and choosing which customers I want to treat well when they walk in the door. Oh, you seem like a good customer with a lot of money. I'm going to treat you well. Oh, you seem like the kind of customer that we don't really value here. We're going to treat you a little bit roughly and let you know that. Then the customers are going to notice that and they're going to pick a different business. They're going to, even if they can afford to shop there. If you have merciless relationships with suppliers, the suppliers are going to remember that. And so if you need a favor from them, they're going to be like, no, sorry, you're merciless with me. I'm going to be merciless with you. Communities, if you're really rough with your communities, maybe the community tries to chase you out of town, like there are a number of different ways that you might not realize that somebody can affect you, that they can then come back and affect you later. So what you put into the world comes back. And a lot of times we're not going to know why or how or when. But it will come back. A lot of times it will come back. And so doing right by people, fair to yourself as well, in terms of we got to make a profit. We got to have enough money coming in per unit to keep the lights on. But treating people fairly and ethically in a lot of ways is a very important insurance policy that keeps some of the bad negative consequences from falling down upon you that you just might not foresee, and keep good positive consequences coming to you that you also might not foresee.